Elliot Hayes wasn't someone who sought attention. At 62, his life was comfortably simple. A small, cozy home on the outskirts of the city, a garden he tended with care, and evenings spent in quiet reflection. The world beyond his doorstep often felt chaotic, but Elliot's sanctuary was a retreat from the noise, a place where he could reconnect with himself and his faith. Since his youth, Elliot had always believed in something greater. Whether it was God, fate, or some unseen force, he couldn't say for certain, but he knew it was there. Life, after all, had a way of weaving moments together in a pattern that felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. But this belief wasn't something he spoke of often. It was deeply personal, like a soft flame he guarded against the winds of doubt. One night, long after the sun had set and the neighborhood had grown still, Elliot prepared for bed. The day had been long, filled with the small but meaningful tasks of tending to his life. Running errands, visiting a friend recovering from surgery, and volunteering at the community library. By the time evening came, his body ached, and exhaustion weighed on him like a heavy blanket. Still, he couldn't end the day without his nightly meditation. Elliot's practice wasn't formal or extravagant. For years, he'd recited an ancient hymn passed down from his grandmother, a woman of unwavering faith. The hymn, known as the Evening Supplication, was a simple prayer of gratitude and a request for guidance. "I promised myself I'd never miss a day," Elliot often told himself. And he hadn't, not once in over 3 decades. Settling into his favorite armchair, Elliot lit a small candle on the nearby table. Its gentle glow flickered against the shadows of the room, creating an atmosphere of peace. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to recite the hymn. "Guide me, O gentle hand, through the darkness of the night." His voice was steady but quiet, barely rising above a whisper. The words, though familiar, carried a weight of sincerity each time he spoke them. But as he continued, fatigue began to pull at him. His head dipped forward, and his voice faltered. He fought to stay awake, forcing himself to sit up straighter and refocus. "Light the path beneath my feet." The words trailed off as sleep overtook him. His breathing slowed, and his hands, which had been clasped together in prayer, loosened. The room grew still, the only sound a faint rustle of the leaves outside his window. And then it happened. A voice, soft, warm, and impossibly gentle, spoke his name. "Elliot," it said, with a tone so tender it felt like a caress. He stirred but didn't wake. The voice came again, this time with a gentle nudge of urgency. "Elliot, aren't you going to finish your prayer?" His eyes flew open. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure if he was still dreaming. The room was as it had been, quiet and empty, the candle still flickering on the table. Yet the voice lingered, its warmth settling over him like a soft embrace. Elliot's first instinct was to call out. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But even as the words left his lips, he knew there would be no response. Deep within, he already understood. "It was you," he murmured, a smile breaking across his face. Elliot had read about guardian angels in books and scriptures, but he'd never imagined an encounter so intimate, so personal. The voice had felt like a friend, familiar and kind, yet otherworldly. He didn't question its presence. Instead, he was filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes welling with tears. With renewed energy, Elliot straightened in his chair and resumed the hymn. His voice, though still soft, carried a steadiness it hadn't before. He finished the prayer with a clarity and focus that felt almost sacred. As the final words left his lips, a sense of peace washed over him. It was as if the weight of the day, the exhaustion, and even the lingering doubts that sometimes crept into his mind had been lifted. For the first time in a long while, Elliot felt truly seen. When he finally stood to blow out the candle, he glanced around the room one last time. The shadows seemed softer somehow, less imposing. The air felt charged with a warmth that hadn't been there before. Elliot climbed into bed that night, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He didn't tell anyone about the experience the next day, or even in the weeks that followed. It wasn't that he was afraid of being ridiculed. He simply felt that the moment was too sacred to share. Instead, he carried it with him like a hidden treasure, a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone. Whenever doubt crept into his mind, or the challenges of life threatened to overwhelm him, he would think back to that gentle voice. Over time, the memory of that night became a cornerstone of Elliot's faith. It wasn't just the words that stayed with him. It was the way they had been spoken, the kindness and care imbued in them. It was the reassurance that even in his quiet, unremarkable life, he mattered to something beyond himself. Years later, when Elliot reflected on his life, he would often think of that night as a turning point. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was the moment when he truly began to trust in the unseen. It was the night he realized that even the smallest acts of devotion, like reciting an old hymn by candlelight, could draw the attention of something divine. And though he would go on to experience other moments of grace, other whispers of guidance, that first encounter held a special place in his heart. For it was then that he first heard the voice of his guardian angel, a gentle nudge from a presence that had been with him all along, quietly guiding him through the winding path of life. It had been several months since Elliot's quiet encounter with the voice in his living room. Life had carried on in its unhurried rhythm, with its small joys and occasional frustrations. Yet Elliot could feel something within him had shifted. He moved through his days with a heightened sense of awareness, paying closer attention to the subtleties of life. The way sunlight filtered through the trees, the laughter of children playing in the park, or even the unexpected kindness of a stranger. It was as if the world itself had softened, revealing layers of grace he'd overlooked before. One cold winter evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, Elliot found himself behind the wheel of his old sedan, driving home from a nearby town. The journey was familiar, a winding stretch of rural road bordered by dense forests on either side. Snow had begun to fall earlier in the day, blanketing the landscape in white. It was beautiful, almost serene, but it also made driving treacherous. Elliot had been visiting an old friend who was recovering from surgery. The visit had been pleasant, filled with warm tea and reminiscing about the past. As he drove, he thought about their conversation, feeling grateful for the friendship that had endured over the decades. But the contentment he felt was tinged with unease. The roads were slick, and the temperature was dropping rapidly, turning the snow into a thin, invisible layer of ice. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles widening as he navigated the curves of the road. The headlights illuminated the way ahead, their beams cutting through the encroaching darkness. The radio was off. Elliot preferred the quiet, though tonight the silence felt heavy, pressing against him like a weight. As he rounded a sharp bend, the car's tires suddenly lost traction. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle skidded sideways, sliding perilously close to the edge of a steep embankment. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, a surge of adrenaline flooding his system. Instinctively, he yanked the wheel, but it only made things worse. The car spun, its rear end fishtailing wildly. "Dear God," Elliot gasped, his voice trembling. Just as panic threatened to take over, a voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. "Steady now. Turn slowly." The words were clear, almost as if someone was sitting beside him. Elliot didn't have time to question their source. He obeyed instinctively, easing his grip on the wheel and gently turning it in the direction of the skid, as if guided by unseen hands. The tires found traction just in time. The car straightened, and Elliot managed to pull over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. For a moment, he just sat there, the engine idling and his breath coming in shallow gasps. His heart felt like it was trying to escape his chest. He looked around, half expecting to see someone there, a passerby, perhaps, or even a good Samaritan who had stopped to help. But the road was empty, and the snow continued to fall in a silent curtain. "Who was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The air inside the car felt charged, almost alive, as if it held the lingering echo of the voice. It wasn't the first time Elliot had experienced something like this, but it was certainly the most urgent, the most tangible. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. The warmth he'd felt on that night months ago, the night of the hymn, returned, enveloping him like an invisible blanket. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice breaking. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but the gratitude he felt was overwhelming. After a few moments, Elliot carefully merged back onto the road, driving at an even slower pace. The rest of the journey was uneventful, though he remained hyper-aware of every turn and patch of ice. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the relief was almost overwhelming. He sat in the car for a while, staring at the snow-covered bushes in front of his house, replaying the moment in his mind. That night, as he sat by the fire with a cup of chamomile tea, Elliot reflected on what had happened. The voice hadn't felt like his own thoughts. It had been external, distinct, yet somehow familiar. It reminded him of the voice that had awakened him that night on the couch, urging him to finish his prayer. Was it the same presence, his guardian angel? Or was it some deeper part of himself, awakened by years of faith and practice? Elliot didn't have the answers, but he didn't feel the need to analyze it too deeply. What mattered was the sense of protection he felt, the knowledge that someone, had been there in his moment of need. Over the following days, Elliot found himself sharing the story with a close friend, Mia, during their weekly coffee meetup. Mia was an artist, her worldview shaped by a blend of spirituality and creativity. She listened intently as Elliot recounted the events, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like you were guided," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "Whether it was an angel, your higher self, or some divine intervention, the message is clear. You're not alone." Elliot nodded, her words resonating deeply. "It felt comforting," he said. "Even in the chaos, there was this sense of calm, like someone had my back." Mia's mind. That's the thing about faith, isn't it? It's not about having all the answers. It's about trusting the process, even when you can't see the bigger picture. That conversation stayed with Elliot, shaping the way he viewed the incident. Over time, he came to see it as more than just a near miss on a dangerous road. It was a reminder of the unseen forces at work in his life, guiding him through the shadows. From that point on, Elliot approached his days with a renewed sense of wonder. Every challenge, every moment of uncertainty became an opportunity to lean into that trust. And though he would face other trials in the years to come, the memory of that winter evening remained a beacon, a quiet testament to the power of surrender and the mysterious grace that surrounds us all. Elliot had always been a creature of habit. His days followed a steady rhythm. Morning tea, tending to the small vegetable garden behind his house, reading by the window as the afternoon sun warmed the room, and evening walks through the park near his neighborhood. He found comfort in the predictability of his routine, though he left room for surprises, those small, unplanned moments that life often brought his way. It was during one of these evening walks, a mild spring day, when the air carried the scent of blooming flowers, that something extraordinary happened. The park was a place Elliot knew well, with its winding trails, wooden benches, and a picturesque lake nestled among the trees. He'd walked every path countless times, or so he thought. That evening, as Elliot strolled along a familiar trail, his mind wandered. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, their melodies blending with the gentle rustle of the trees swaying in the breeze. It was peaceful, the kind of tranquility Elliot cherished. He had set out with a goal that evening, to find a specific trail he hadn't visited in years. It led to a secluded clearing by the lake, a spot he remembered fondly from his younger days. But as he walked, he realized he couldn't quite recall which path led there. The trails branched in several directions, and the subtle changes in the park over the years had made it harder to recognize landmarks. Frustration crept in as Elliot took one wrong turn after another. The more he tried to retrace his steps, the more disoriented he felt. He stopped at a crossroads, the sun now dipping lower in the sky, painting the horizon in soft oranges and pinks. The air cooled, and the shadows grew longer. "Which way?" he muttered, scanning the paths in front of him. As he stood there, debating whether to turn back and admit defeat, a voice startled him. "Are you looking for the lake?" Elliot turned quickly. Standing a few feet away was a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He wore a light blue sweater and khaki shorts, his dark hair slightly tousled. The boy's eyes were bright, filled with a kind of knowing that seemed beyond his years. "Yes," Elliot replied, surprised. "I am. Do you know the way?" The boy smiled, a warm and reassuring expression that immediately put Elliot at ease. "It's just over there," he said, pointing toward a narrow, overgrown path to the left. "It's easy to miss." Elliot followed the boy's gesture, noticing the trail he hadn't seen before. "Thank you," he said, glancing back at the boy. But the words caught in his throat. The boy was gone. Elliot blinked, his eyes scanning the area. The park was quiet, and there was no sign of the child. A chill ran down his spine, but it wasn't fear, more a sense of awe, as if he'd been touched by something beyond comprehension. He turned back to the path the boy had pointed to. It was indeed narrow, almost hidden by the tall grass and low-hanging branches. Hesitant but curious, Elliot stepped onto the trail. It twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the woods. The sounds of the park faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. And then he saw it. The clearing opened up to reveal the lake, its surface reflecting the vibrant hues of the sunset. The water shimmered like liquid gold, and the surrounding trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches framing the scene as if nature itself had painted it. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was more beautiful than he'd remembered. He walked to the edge of the lake, taking in the stillness, the perfection of the moment. Sitting on a fallen log, he allowed himself to simply be, his heart swelling with gratitude. The frustrations of earlier melted away, replaced by a deep sense of peace. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring him here, to remind him of the beauty that existed beyond the limits of his own understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elliot reflected on the boy who had guided him. Who was he? A passerby? A trick of the mind? Or something more? The memory of the boy's knowing smile lingered. It reminded Elliot of other moments in his life, moments when things had fallen into place in ways that defied explanation. The voice that had woken him during his prayer, the calm presence that had guided him through the icy road, and now this mysterious child. It felt as though these events were connected, pieces of a larger tapestry he was only beginning to glimpse. When he finally rose to leave, the stars had begun to appear, twinkling in the indigo sky. He retraced his steps along the hidden path, marveling at how he hadn't noticed it before. The journey back felt shorter, lighter, as if the woods themselves had cleared the way for him. That night, as he fingered the edge of his journal, Elliot considered writing the experience down. He'd begun documenting moments like these after his encounter on the icy road, not to analyze them, but to preserve them. Yet something held him back this time. The memory of the boy felt sacred, almost fragile, as if putting it into words might diminish its magic. Instead, Elliot closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. He didn't need to understand the how or why of what had happened. It was enough to know he wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching over him, guiding him in ways he couldn't always see. As sleep claimed him that night, Elliot dreamed of the lake. In his dream, the boy was there, standing by the water's edge, his back to Elliot. When the boy turned, his face was radiant, glowing with a light that seemed to come from within. He didn't speak, but his smile conveyed everything Elliot needed to know. "You're on the right path. Keep walking. Elliot woke with a start, the image of the boy's smile etched in his mind. Though the dream faded as the day began, the feeling it left behind stayed with him. A quiet assurance that the unexpected messengers in his life were not coincidences, but reminders of a greater presence guiding him, step by step. Elliot Hayes had always considered himself a practical man. Though he believed in faith and the unseen forces that shaped life's winding paths, his feet were firmly planted on the ground. Dreams, for him, had always been fleeting, scattered fragments of the subconscious mind. But one night, everything he thought he understood about dreams, and perhaps reality itself, would be forever changed. It began like any other restless night. Elliot had tossed and turned for hours, unable to quiet the stream of thoughts racing through his mind. At 63, sleep often eluded him, his body betraying him with aches and his mind refusing to settle. That evening, a vague unease hung over him, though he couldn't quite place its source. Finally, unable to endure the futility of lying awake any longer, Elliot rose from his bed. The house was silent, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. He made his way to the living room, where he often went to find solace in sleepless nights. Settling into his favorite armchair, he lit a candle and let its flickering light dance across the room. The stillness calmed him, though the unease remained, lingering at the edges of his consciousness like a shadow he couldn't shake. Closing his eyes, he whispered a simple prayer, a plea for rest, for clarity, for peace. As the words left his lips, he felt a subtle shift in the air, as if the room itself had exhaled. When sleep finally came, it was swift and deep, pulling him into a world unlike any he'd known before. Elliot found himself standing in a garden that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. It was unlike any garden he had ever seen, lush and vibrant, every leaf and flower glowing with an inner light. The air was perfumed with the sweet, intoxicating scent of blossoms, though he couldn't name a single one. The sky above was a radiant tapestry of colors, shifting and blending like liquid gold and sapphire. The most remarkable thing about the garden, however, was its silence. It wasn't the empty, hollow kind of silence that filled his sleepless nights. This was a silence that hummed with life, as if the entire garden were breathing in unison with him. Elliot began to walk, his bare feet sinking into the soft, mossy ground. The path before him seemed to appear as he moved, weaving through the foliage with effortless grace. He felt no fear, no confusion, only an overwhelming sense of peace, as though he were exactly where he was meant to be. As he walked, he became aware of a presence. At first, it was subtle, like a faint warmth on his skin. But as he continued, it grew stronger, more tangible, until he felt it all around him. He stopped and turned, his breath catching as he saw her. A figure stood a short distance away, bathed in a soft, golden glow. She was radiant, her features both striking and gentle, as if they had been carved from light itself. Her eyes were the most extraordinary shade of blue, deep and endless, like the ocean on a calm day. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves, shimmering like spun silver. She wore a flowing gown that seemed to shift and ripple as though made of water and starlight. Elliot couldn't speak. Words felt inadequate in her presence, as if they would shatter the fragile perfection of the moment. The woman, if she could be called that, regarded him with a smile that carried infinite kindness, infinite understanding. She didn't need to speak. Her expression conveyed everything. Yet, she did speak, and her voice was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't loud or forceful. It was soft and melodic, resonating in a way that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight to his soul. "Welcome, Elliot," she said, her tone filled with warmth. "You've walked a long road to be here." Where am I?" he finally managed to ask, his voice trembling. "You are where you've always been," she replied cryptically. In the garden of your heart. Elliot didn't understand her words, but he didn't question them. He felt an inexplicable trust in her, as though she had known him his entire life, perhaps even longer. She stepped closer, and though she moved with the grace of a breeze, the earth beneath her seemed to ripple in response. "There is something you must remember," she said, her gaze holding his. "You are never alone, not in this world or the next. The light that guides you is within you, always." Tears welled in Elliot's eyes. He didn't know why her words touched him so deeply, but they did. He thought of all the moments in his life when he had felt that unseen presence, the voice that woke him during prayer, the guidance that steadied him on icy roads, the boy who pointed him to the hidden path by the lake. It had all been leading to this moment, this realization. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She smiled again, her radiance growing brighter. "I am a part of you, as you are a part of me. We are all connected, Elliot, threads in the same tapestry. You call me guardian, angel, guide. The name doesn't matter." She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was warm, soothing, and filled with a love so profound it brought Elliot to his knees. He bowed his head, overcome by the weight of her presence, by the enormity of what he was experiencing. "Rise," she said gently. "Your journey is far from over. There is still much to do, much to see. But remember this, no matter how dark the path may seem, the light is always within reach." Elliot looked up, and the garden seemed to glow brighter, the colors more vivid, the air more alive. He wanted to stay, to remain in this place of perfect peace, but he felt himself being pulled away, as though an invisible tide were carrying him back. "Wait," he called out, reaching for her. "Will I see you again?" Her voice echoed in his mind as her form began to fade, her light blending with the garden around her. "You will see me in every moment of grace, in every act of love. I am always with you." Elliot woke with a start, his breath coming up short as if he had run a great distance. The room was quiet, the candle burned low, but the memory of the garden and the being was vivid in his mind, more vivid than any dream he'd ever had. He sat for a long time, trying to process what he had experienced. It hadn't felt like a dream. It felt real, more real, in fact, than the room around him. He thought of her words, the warmth of her touch, and the peace that had enveloped him. For the first time in years, Elliot felt truly whole, as though a missing piece of his soul had been returned. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was never alone. And that knowledge was enough to carry him forward, one step at a time. Life after the dream in the garden felt different for Elliot Hayes, though he couldn't quite explain how. Outwardly, nothing had changed. His days still followed the same gentle rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons at the library, and evenings of quiet reflection. But inwardly, he felt as though he were moving through life with new eyes, a heightened awareness of the subtleties he might once have ignored. It was as if the dream had awakened something dormant within him. Colors seemed brighter, sounds richer, and even the mundane routines of life took on a kind of sacredness. He couldn't shake the memory of the radiant figure in the garden, her words echoing in his mind like a melody he couldn't forget. The light is always within reach. One brisk autumn morning, Elliot decided to visit a local farmer's market. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. He loved this time of year, when the trees exploded in hues of orange and gold, and the world seemed to slow down in preparation for winter. The market was a vibrant collection of stalls selling fresh produce, handmade crafts, and baked goods. It was a place of community, a gathering of familiar faces and friendly smiles. Elliot wandered from stall to stall, pausing to admire the neatly arranged rows of apples, jars of honey glistening in the sunlight, and bundles of dried lavender tied with twine. He exchanged pleasantries with the vendors, their warm chatter adding to the lively atmosphere. As he strolled, he caught sight of a booth selling handmade wind chimes. They were crafted from various materials: polished wood, painted ceramic, and even bits of glass that sparkled in the light. One in particular caught his eye. It was simple but elegant, made of smooth driftwood and delicate silver chimes that swayed gently in the breeze. Elliot reached out to touch it, the cool metal of the chimes sending a shiver through his fingertips. As he stood there, a soft wind stirred, causing the chimes to sing. The sound was ethereal, a lilting melody that seemed to fill the space around him. It wasn't loud or overbearing. It was subtle, almost like a whisper. And in that moment, Elliot felt it again. That familiar presence, the warmth that had become so familiar in his life. The voice didn't speak this time, but the feeling was unmistakable. It was as if the wind itself were carrying a message, urging him to pay attention. He purchased the wind chime without hesitation, carrying it home like a treasured artifact. When he arrived, he hung it on the porch outside his living room window, where the breeze could reach it. For the rest of the day, he found himself drawn to its soft, melodic tones. It was as if the chime had become a bridge, connecting him to something greater. That evening, Elliot invited his neighbor, Mia, over for tea. Mia was one of the few people with whom Elliot felt comfortable sharing his experiences. She was an artist, her mind open to the mysteries of life, and she had a way of listening that made Elliot feel truly heard. As they sat in the cozy living room, the faint sound of the wind chime drifting through the open window, Elliot recounted the events of the day. He described the farmer's market, the moment the wind stirred the chimes, and the sense of connection he had felt. Mia smiled as she listened, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Elliot," she said, "it sounds like the chime is more than just an object to you. It's almost like a messenger." Elliot nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly how it feels, like it's trying to tell me something, even if I don't fully understand what." Mia leaned forward, her hands cradling her cup of tea. "I've always believed that the universe speaks to us in whispers. Sometimes it's in the form of a person, a dream, or even something as simple as the wind. It's not always about understanding the message right away. Sometimes it's just about being open to it." Her words resonated deeply with Elliot. He thought about all the moments in his life when he had felt guided. The voice that woke him during prayer, the calm presence on the icy road, the boy in the park. Each had been like a whisper in the wind, subtle and fleeting, but undeniably real. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable conversation, and when Mia left, Elliot stood on the porch, watching the wind chimes sway in the breeze. The stars above were bright, their light cutting through the inky darkness of the sky. As he gazed at them, he felt a sense of quiet assurance, as if the universe itself were nodding in agreement with Mia's words. In the days that followed, the wind chime became a constant companion. Its soft melodies were a source of comfort, a reminder of the presence that had been with him all along. And though he didn't hear the voice again, he began to notice other signs, small, seemingly insignificant events that felt charged with meaning. One afternoon, as he was tending to his garden, a butterfly landed on the edge of his trowel. Its wings were an iridescent blend of blue and gold, shimmering in the sunlight. Elliot froze, watching as it lingered for a moment before taking flight. It was a small thing, but it filled him with a sense of wonder. Another time, while reading by the window, he glanced up to see a group of sparrows perched on the porch railing, their tiny bodies puffed up against the chill. They chirped softly, their presence filling the quiet room with life. Each of these moments, though fleeting, felt like a reminder: you are not alone. The light is always within reach. One evening, as the wind picked up and the chimes sang its haunting melody, Elliot sat down with his journal. He began to write, documenting the events of the past weeks: the dream in the garden, the wind chime, the butterfly, the sparrows. As he wrote, he realized something profound. These moments were not isolated. They were threads in a larger tapestry, each one connected to the others, forming a pattern he was only beginning to understand. He thought of the radiant figure in his dream, her words echoing in his mind. You will see me in every moment of grace, in every act of love. Elliot set down his pen, his heart full. He didn't need to understand everything. It was enough to know that the whispers in the wind, the small signs and moments of connection, were leading him somewhere, toward a deeper understanding of himself, of life, and of the infinite love that surrounded him. As the chime's melody filled the room, Elliot closed his eyes and whispered a simple prayer. Thank you. Elliot Hayes sat by the window of his cozy home, the late afternoon sunlight casting a golden hue over the room. Outside, the leaves of the old oak tree in his yard swayed gently in the breeze, their rustling like a quiet conversation with the wind. The soft sound of his wind chime filled the air, a melody that had become a constant presence in his life. It was no longer just an object hanging on his porch. It had become a symbol, a companion in his spiritual journey. At 63, Elliot found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him to this moment. The encounters, the whispers, the signs, they were all threads in the tapestry of his life, weaving a picture of connection, grace, and quiet assurance. He had come to accept that the presence he had felt so often was real, a guiding force that had been with him all along. This realization didn't come with fanfare or grand revelations. It was a quiet knowing, like a steady flame that warmed him from within. And it was this sense of peace that brought him to his writing desk that day, a journal open before him, its pages filled with the stories he'd begun recording over the past few months. The journal was more than a collection of memories. It was a way for Elliot to honor the moments that had shaped him. He wrote about the voice that had woken him during prayer, urging him to finish what he had begun. He wrote about the icy road and the calm presence that had guided him to safety. He recounted the boy in the park, the dream of the garden, and the wind chime that now sang to him daily. As he wrote, he paused often, his pen hovering above the page as he reflected on the significance of each event. What struck him most wasn't the extraordinary nature of these moments, but their subtlety. They weren't loud proclamations or dramatic miracles. They were whispers, soft, fleeting, yet undeniably real. It occurred to Elliot that these experiences weren't unique to him. Everyone, he thought, had their own whispers in the wind, their own quiet moments of grace. The difference was whether or not they noticed them. How often, he wondered, did people brush aside these moments, dismissing them as coincidences or tricks of the mind? How many missed the presence of something greater simply because they weren't looking? He thought of the figure in his dream, her radiant light and kind smile. You will see me in every moment of grace, in every act of love. Her words had stayed with him, a reminder that the divine wasn't confined to the extraordinary. It was in the everyday, in the warmth of a sunrise, the laughter of a friend, the touch of a breeze on his face. Elliot closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. The wind chimes swayed in the breeze, its delicate song carrying through the air. He smiled, a sense of contentment settling over him. He didn't need to understand everything. It was enough to know he was part of something greater, that he was never truly alone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elliot took his usual walk through the park. The air was cool, and the leaves crunched beneath his feet. He felt a deep connection to the world around him, as though the very earth beneath him was alive with the same presence he had felt so often. As he walked, he passed others enjoying the autumn evening. A young couple laughing as they tossed a frisbee, an older man walking his dog, a child chasing a flock of pigeons. Elliot smiled at each of them, feeling a sense of kinship, of shared humanity. They were all part of the same tapestry, each thread unique yet interconnected. He reached his favorite bench near the lake and sat down, watching the water ripple in the fading light. The stillness of the moment reminded him of the garden in his dream, its colors and sounds etched vividly in his memory. Closing his eyes, he let himself sink into the peace of the present, his breathing slow and steady. It was in this stillness that he felt it again, the presence. It wasn't a voice this time, nor a sudden realization. It was simply a feeling, a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. It was as if the universe itself were wrapping him in an embrace, reminding him of its constant presence. Tears welled in Elliot's eyes, not from sadness but from a deep sense of gratitude. He thought of all the times he had felt lost, uncertain, or afraid, and how he had always been guided back to the light. The presence had been with him in those moments, quietly urging him forward, even when he hadn't realized it. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. He sat there until the stars began to appear, their light reflecting on the surface of the lake like scattered diamonds. When he finally rose to leave, he felt lighter, as though a burden he hadn't even known he was carrying had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, Elliot continued to write in his journal, pouring his thoughts and reflections onto its pages. He didn't write for anyone else. It was a deeply personal act, a way of honoring the journey he had walked and the presence that had guided him. One day, while leafing through the journal, an idea came to him. What if these stories could help others? What if, by sharing his experiences, he could encourage someone else to notice the whispers in their own life? The thought both excited and frightened him. Elliot had never considered himself a writer, much less someone who could share something so deeply personal with the world. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt a quiet urging, a nudge, as he had come to call it. It wasn't a voice, but the feeling was the same, a gentle push in the right direction. And so, Elliot began to write, not in his private journal, but on blank pages meant for others to read. He wrote about the whispers, the signs, the moments of grace that had shaped his life. He wrote not to preach or convince, but simply to share, to remind others that they were never alone, that the light was always within reach. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Elliot's words found their way to others. Some were friends, some strangers, but all of them found something in his stories that resonated. Letters began to arrive, notes of gratitude, of shared experiences, of newfound hope. Elliot read each letter with tears in his eyes, humbled by the impact his words had made. He realized that the presence he had felt wasn't just for him. It was for everyone, a gift that could be shared, multiplied, and carried forward. And so, Elliot's journey continued, not in solitude, but as part of a larger tapestry. He didn't know where the path would lead, but he no longer needed to. It was enough to walk forward, guided by the whispers in the wind and the quiet assurance of a voice eternal.